In this video, you're going to take the code we have here that we created in the last video and break it out into its own file, similar to what we did with the geocoding API request, where we call geocode address instead of actually having the request call in app.js. That means we're going to make a new folder, a new file, and we'll create a function in there that gets exported. After that, we're going to go ahead and learn how to chain callbacks together. So when we get that address from the terminal, we can convert that into coordinates, and we can take those coordinates and convert them into temperature information, or whatever weather data we want to pull off of the return result from the forecast API. Now, before we can dive into any of that, I'm going to go ahead and create that brand new file, and we'll worry about getting this code into that function. Then there's going to be a challenge where you'll be responsible for creating that callback. Before we dive into any of that though, let's go ahead and make the directory. The directory is going to be called weather, and in the weather directory, we'll make a new file called weather.js. Awesome. Now in here, we can take all of the code from app.js, cut it out, and paste it. The only thing we need to do in order to take this and convert it to what we actually need is to create that function that's going to get exported, and then we can move our call to request inside of it. I'm going to make a brand new function called getWeather. GetWeather is going to take some arguments, but that'll be part of the challenge. For now, I'm going to leave the arguments list empty, and down below, I'm going to take our call to request and move it inside. From here, we can go ahead and export this getWeather function. Module.exports.getWeather is going to get set equal to the getWeather function that we defined up above. Now that we have this in place, we can go ahead and move into app.js to add some stuff here. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the API key. We no longer need that. And I'm going to highlight all of the commented code and uncomment it using command /. Awesome. Now, in order to go ahead and set this challenge up, I am going to import the file, creating a const called weather, and setting it equal to the require return result. In this case, we're requiring that brand new file we just created. We're going to provide a relative path // because we're loading in a file that we wrote. Then we're going to provide the directory name weather followed by the file name weather.js, and we can leave off that JS extension as we already know. Now that we have the weather API loaded in, down below, we can go ahead and call it. I'm going to comment out our call to geocode address real quick. And down below, we're going to go ahead and run weather.getWeather. Now, as I mentioned, there will be arguments in the future. For now, we're going to go ahead and leave them empty, and we can run our file from the terminal. This means we should see the weather printing for whatever coordinates you hard-coded in the previous video. In this case, those coordinates are for Philadelphia, so I'm going to go ahead and run node app.js with no address argument. Actually, I am going to need to provide an address since I haven't commented out the yargs code, so I'll go ahead and do that. Address, and this is just a dummy address. I'm going to use a zip code in New Jersey. From here, the geolocation code is never running because that is commented out, but we are running the weather code that got moved to the new file, and we are indeed seeing a temperature 80.52 degrees, which means that the code is properly getting executed over in the new file. Now, your challenge for this video is going to be to take the weather function, getWeather, and make it similar to the geocode address function. And that means we're going to need to pass in some arguments, including a callback function. And over here, we're going to need to use those arguments instead of a static lat long pair. And we're also going to need to call the callback instead of using console.log. So let's break down what those arguments are going to be. I'm going to leave a little comment right here. First up, you're going to want to pass in the latitude. For now, what I'd like you to do is take the static data, like this number, copy it, and just paste it right inside of the arguments list. And you can do the same thing for longitude. Then you're going to go ahead and provide a callback function. And that callback function, it's going to take the same two arguments that the geocode address function takes right here, error message and results. The error message is going to be a string you can print to the screen, and the result is going to contain the weather, which we also want to print to the screen. Now, once you have those three arguments set up here, and you have your if statements that print the appropriate data, you can go ahead and actually make those changes to weather.js. You're going to want to take the latitude and longitude arguments and use those inside of the URL. You can go ahead and use template strings to do that, which we've already used heavily in the course. Then you need to use that callback function. In this case, you're going to provide an error message argument and no results argument. Same for this one. Down below, instead of calling console log, you're going to call the callback. This time, though, you're going to provide undefined for the error message, because in this case, there is no error. Instead, you're going to provide the results object. Now, I'd like you to print the temperature and the actual temperature properties. That's going to let us print a message like it is 56 in Philadelphia, but it feels like 61. Something along those lines. You can explore all of the properties available and add any you like to the message, but those are the two I really want, the temperature and the actual temperature. Now that means you are going to print the object to the screen over in app.js like we do here. There is no need to actually print the formatted string just yet. We'll worry about that once we integrate the entire app. So take a moment to knock that out. Add the 3 arguments here. This is where the console log calls are going to happen like they do above. And in weather.js, you're going to remove all the console log calls, replacing them with callback calls. And you're going to remove the static longitude and latitude pairs. Take a moment to pause the video, knock that out, test it from the terminal. Make sure you get the same data because you should be using the same static coordinates. And when you're done, go ahead and click play. Note, the temperature might go up or down by a few degrees depending on what time of day you're watching the video. How'd you do? Hopefully you were able to wire up those arguments as well as the callback. Now, the first thing I'm going to do before I actually change the weather.js code is change the app.js code. I'm going to pass in the other 2 arguments. The next one is going to be the other part of our coordinate pair. I'm going to grab that from the URL, copy it, and paste it over inside of app.js as the second argument. Then I can go ahead and provide the third one, which is going to be the callback function. This function is going to get fired once the weather data comes back from the API. I'm going to use an arrow function that's going to get those 2 arguments we discussed earlier, error message and results. The results containing any sort of temperature information we want. In this case, it could be the temperature and the actual temperature, although you might have included others. I'm going to change results to weather results, and I'll talk about why in a second. Long story short, I want to differentiate weather results from the results variable up in geocode address. Now, obviously, I did not mention this when I gave you the challenge, so you can go ahead and just change it now. Inside of getWeather, we now need to use if-else statements in order to print the appropriate thing to the screen, depending on whether or not the error message exists. If there is an error message, we do want to go ahead and print it using console.log. In this case, we're just going to pass in the error message variable. Now, if there is no error message, we're going to go ahead and use the weather results object. We'll be printing a nice formatted message a little bit later. For now, we can simply print the weather results object using that pretty printing technique we talked about, where we call json.stringify inside of console.log. Here, I'm going to provide those 3 arguments, the actual object, weather results, undefined for our filtering function, and a number for our indentation. In this case, I'm going to go with 2 once again. And now that we have our getWeather call getting called with all 3 arguments, we can go ahead and actually implement this inside of weather.js. To get started, I'm going to make the URL right here dynamic, which means I need to replace the strings with template strings. Very cool. Now that I have template strings in place, I can inject those arguments, latitude and longitude, right into the URL. Let's go ahead and define all the arguments that are getting passed in. We have the lat, the long, and our callback. First up, let's inject that latitude. I'm going to take the 39.93, remove it, and between the / and the comma, I'm going to inject it using $ with our curly braces, which lets us inject a value into our template string, in this case, lat. And we can do the exact same thing right after the comma with the longitude. I'm going to remove the static longitude, use the $ with our curly braces to inject the variable into the string. Now that the URL is dynamic, the last thing we need to do inside of getWeather is change our console log calls to callback calls. And now for the first 2 console log calls, we can actually replace console.log with callback. And this is going to line up with the arguments that we specified over in app.js, where the first one is the error message and the second one is the weather results. In this case, we're passing the error message back, and the second argument is undefined, which it should be. We can do the same thing right here for unable to fetch weather. Now, the third console log call is going to be a little more complex. we're going to have to actually create an object instead of just passing the temperature back. I am going to call the callback with the first argument being undefined, because in this case, there is no error message. Instead, we're going to provide that weather results object. Right here, we can define all the temperature properties we like. In this case, I am going to define temperature, setting it equal to body dot currently, which stores all of the current weather data, dot temperature. Awesome. Now that we have the temperature, whoops, I am missing the dot right here, we can go ahead and provide that second property to the object, which is actual temperature. Actual temperature is going to account for things like humidity, wind speed, and other weather conditions. The actual temperature data is available under a property on currently called apparent temperature. I'm going to go ahead and provide that right here. And as the value, we're going to use the same thing. This is going to be body dot currently. This gets us to the currently object, just like we do for temperature. Then we can provide apparent temperature. Awesome. Now we have our two properties, so we can go ahead and remove that console.log statement, add a semicolon, and now we can go ahead and run the app because everything is done. We have our getWeather function wired up both inside of the weather.js file and inside of app.js. Now, once again, we are still using static coordinates, but this will be the last time we run the file with that static data. From the terminal, I'm going to rerun the application. And right here, we get our temperature object printing to the screen. We have our temperature property, 81.61, and we have the apparent temperature, which is already at 87 degrees this early in the morning. With this in place, we're now ready to learn how to chain our callbacks together. That means in app.js, we're going to take the results that come back from geocode address, pass them in to getWeather, and use that to print dynamic weather for whatever address you provide over here in the terminal. In this case, I would get the address for the town in New Jersey as opposed to the static address, which I'm using right now. That latitude-longitude pair is for Philadelphia. To get started, we have to take our getWeather call and actually move it inside of the callback function for geocode address, because inside this callback function is the only place we have access to the latitude and longitude pairs. Now, if I open the geocode.js file, you can remember that we get the formatted address back as the address property, we get the latitude back as latitude, and we get longitude back as longitude. I'm going to go ahead and start wiring this up. First up, we do need to remove the comments here, and I'm going to go ahead and take the console log statement in the success case and remove it, replacing it with a console log call that's going to go ahead and print the formatted address. Right here, console.log, printing results.address. This is going to print the address to the screen so we know exactly what address we're getting weather data for. Now that we have our console log printing the address, we can go ahead and take the getWeather call, cut it out, and move it right below that line. And with this in place, we're now really close to actually chaining the two callbacks together. All that's left to do is take these static coordinates and replace them with the dynamic ones, which are going to be available in that results object. The first argument is going to be results.latitude, which we defined right here on the object. And the second one is going to be results.longitude. Awesome. And that's it. This is all we need to do to take the data from geocode address and pass it into getWeather. This is going to create an application that prints our dynamic weather, the weather for the address in the terminal. Now, before we go ahead and run this, I am going to replace the object call with a nicer, more formatted one. We're going to take both of the pieces of information, the temperature and the apparent temperature, and use them in that string, which means we can remove this console log, replacing it with a different one. Console.log. And I am going to use template strings since I plan to inject a few variables in. It's currently, followed by the temperature. I'm going to go ahead and inject that using weather results dot temperature. Awesome. And then I can go ahead and put a period and say something along the lines of, it feels like, followed by the apparent temperature, which I'm going to inject using weather results dot apparent temperature. I'm going to go ahead and put a period after that, and we are done. We now have a console.log statement that prints the weather to the screen. We also have one that prints the address to the screen, and we have error handlers for both geocode address and get weather. Let's go ahead and test this by rerunning the previous command. I'm going to go ahead and use that same zip code 08822. When I run it, I get Flemington, New Jersey as the formatted address, where it currently is 81.56, but it feels like 85.57. Now to test that this is working, I'm going to go ahead and type in something else inside of quotes, something like Key West, Florida. And when I run this command, I do indeed get Key West, Florida right here as the formatted address, where it's currently 84.17, but it feels like 94.2 degrees. With this in place, the weather application is now wired up. We take the address, we get the lat-long pair using the Google Geocode API, then we use our forecast API to take that lat-long pair and convert it into temperature information. With this in place, we're done for this video. Let's take a quick moment to recap what we did. First up, we took that request call that was originally in app.js and we moved it into weather.js, defining it right here. We used a callback to pass the data from weather.js into whatever file happened to call it. In this case, that came from app.js, where we imported weather up above. Down below, inside of the callback for geocode address, we call getWeather. And we only call getWeather in the success case. If geocode address goes bad, we obviously are not going to have the lat-long pair, and we're not going to want to take that information and pass it into getWeather, because the getWeather call would fail. It needs the lat-long in order to work. Now, this is working great because the getWeather call sits right here, and inside of that callback, we print the weather-specific information to the screen. This is either an error message related to the weather API, maybe you have bad coordinate information, or maybe you don't have internet access on your machine. Then, in the success case, we go ahead and print the formatted message to the screen. This is all done using callback functions. That is it for this video. I'll see you next time, where we're going to talk about a different way we can synchronize our asynchronous code using ES6 promises. Stay tuned. I will see you then.